Recognizing the Minister of State for Infrastructure.
Thank you so much, Honorable Speaker. I am so excited to rise today to speak about a bill that the Minister of Transportation and Infrastructure has brought to the floor, Bill 16, the Transportation Amendment Act. And I'm afraid that it's a little bit of a boring, bureaucratic sounding act because it really betrays the importance and how exciting it betrays the importance and the excitement that should surround this act. And I'm glad to hear from some members of the House already some generalized support for this bill, because I certainly do support it as well. And indeed, it's a bill that will enable something that I've had many conversations with colleagues in government about, which is it's integrated transportation and land use development, and in particular, the creation of more transit-oriented developments. So in short, this bill allows the BC Transportation Financing Authority, or the BCTFA, to acquire land for purposes that might not appear directly related to the delivery of transportation infrastructure like highways, subway stations, and so forth. But it is actually an incredibly vital and forward-looking approach to transportation. I'm really, this is a topic that I quite spend a lot of time talking about, and so I'm going to take this opportunity to really nerd out about it. And I'm excited to let you all know that for the next 120 minutes, I'm going to be telling you about how excited I am. No, I'm joking. I max out at 30 minutes, and I'll try not to take up all that time either. So we are talking about building complete walkable communities with housing, childcare, jobs, community amenities, and more near transit hubs, an approach known as transit-oriented development. Now, what's transportation, though, got to do with homes and childcare? What's transportation got to do with the Ministry of Transportation got to do with grocery stores and employment centers? Why should the Ministry of Transportation and Infrastructure, a ministry that has historically had a pretty singular focus on highways and building highways, be in the business of acquiring land for housing, as an example? So that's what I'm going to talk about. So it should be pretty clear from this bill that our government is taking quite a different approach to transportation infrastructure and transportation systems. Very different from the approaches of the past. Because for many decades, spanning the majority of the last century, North American jurisdictions have tried to do what is often described as build their way out of traffic congestion with ever more lanes of roads or ever more highways for cars, only to find themselves facing more and more congestion, and oftentimes spending more and more money to acquire more and more land to lay pavement that might otherwise be used to build livable communities and housing, because they're trying to accommodate more and more cars that are looking to take people to and from their housing and to wherever else that they're trying to get to. And so after all of that investment, that time, that effort, that energy, all that building, people who are traveling end up no better off than when they first started. And what's worse is that the critical goods movement that depends on those roads and highways often is also stuck in the same traffic, in the same congestion. It costs time, it costs money, it impacts our economy, and it's very, very frustrating indeed. So why does that happen? Well, it's because the number of trips or traveling that a person or community or family makes is not absolute. It actually changes depending on a whole lot of different factors, one of which is the availability and ease of the infrastructure made available to them to choose different modes of transportation at various times of day. You see, this refers back to a well-demonstrated phenomenon, which I've talked about in the House before, demonstrated phenomenon in the transportation field, and it's known as induced demand. It basically comes from the very well-known phrase in planning circles that you cannot build your way out of congestion by simply laying more pavement. It's much more complicated than that. And in fact, it sounds counterintuitive in a lot of ways, but despite that, it's actually been demonstrated that in busy and growing areas, laying more pavement to create more space for cars actually produces more car movements to create, and that it creates more car movements than before, which generates more demand and ultimately leaves us trapped in congestion again. But let's be clear now, okay? I mean, we're talking about transit-oriented development as part of this bill. The minister has also noted, though, that it could be applied to other areas of the province, not necessarily just in urban areas. And so speaking and thinking about other areas of the province, I want to emphasize how important our highway networks are. And particularly in a place like British Columbia, they're so, so important. We're quite spread out. It's a very large province. There are many communities outside of urban areas. And in those urban communities outside of urban areas, highways connect people to their families. They connect communities to services and goods to market. They are, for all intents and purposes, very, very necessary parts of our transportation system. They also cost a lot to build. They cost a lot to build, to widen, to expand, to maintain, as is all transportation infrastructure, be they bridges, tunnels, SkyTrains, or more. And so it is incumbent on governments and provincial governments to ensure that those kinds of investments are being made in a very wise way and in a forward-thinking manner that ensures that they last, that they generate value for British Columbians, and that they take into account what is needed in the years ahead as we continue to work to improve affordability, to create livable communities, and, of course, to tackle climate change. And it turns out that taking all of that into account demands a different, newer approach to transportation, one that our government is taking. And that is an approach that is multimodal, that is holistic, that considers what our actual goals are for our transportation systems. So let's talk about the goals of a transportation system. What is the purpose of having a transportation system? What is our purpose in building out transportation systems? Because, I mean, if you think about it, very few people enjoy spending their time trapped in their car in congestion, spending hours of their life in commuting to and from work. Very few people enjoy driving in their vehicles for the sake of driving alone. I mean, I highly doubt very many people think to themselves, you know, what I would really like to do today, is get into my car and be stuck in highway traffic for 2 hours. That sounds like real fun. That's what I'm going to do today. Very few people are going to say that. Nor do I think that many people think to themselves, oh man, what I'd really like to do today is to get out and I really need to clock 150 kilometers on my car just in a big circle. I just need to drive around in a big circle, drive around on all the roads I can find, and I won't feel good unless I drive at least 150 kilometers a day, just for no other reason than for driving. So people aren't traveling, they tend not to travel for the sake of the actual driving itself. So then why is it that governments often measure their transportation success in the number of kilometers of lanes that they've built or paved, or the number of trips that they've generated on this system or that? When, why would we measure success that way when the goal for most people in our communities is certainly to not log as many hours in traffic as they can? Instead, perhaps, we should seek to take an approach that understands why people travel, and that's what Bill 16 is about. So why is it that we travel? Why do we do it? Why do we travel? Why do we get into our cars? Why do we commute? It's because we're trying to get somewhere, and not just anywhere. We're trying to get to someone, to a place, maybe our place of work or our place of study, for instance, or maybe we're trying to get a good or a service and it's only available in a place. So there's a book called Human Transit, and it's by an international consultant in public transit named Jarrett Walker. This book was recommended to me by a local planning consultant, Brent Todderan, and in this book, Mr. Walker suggests thinking about transportation as a system that enables access. It's not really a sexy way to look at it, I realize, but I do think that it's a very productive and helpful way to look at it. And I want to read something that Mr. Walker says about this. He says, and I quote, "Whoever you are and wherever you are, there's an area you could get to in an amount of time that's available in your day. That limit defines a wall around your life. And outside of that wall are places you can't work, places you can't shop, schools you can't attend, clubs you can't belong to, people you can't hang out with, and a whole world of things that you can't do, end quote. So you think about that, and if transportation is about access, about increasing your access to people, places, things, accessing the people that you love to spend time with them, the services that you need, the goods that you consume, your place of employment that you earn income from, the schools that your children learn at, then what would happen if we put all of those things together in a short distance from one another? What if we could walk to all of those things? What if we didn't need to get into our cars and drive 50 kilometers to access them? So what happens when you build housing people can afford close to the jobs that they earn incomes at? How much traveling do they need to do then? So what if we build affordable housing close to jobs, close to schools, close to childcare, close to grocery stores, close to community centers? What if you build them all into walkable, complete communities? And then you center them around transit hubs. Then not only would you be creating communities within which people have the freedom to access everything that they need in a day, but you also position them to be able to access the amenities and services and goods and places and people and things at all of the other complete transit-oriented developments that exist along that transit line or that transit system. And, Mr. Speaker, you can give them that access all without the obligation of bringing their cars with them. So without the obligation of needing to battle traffic, fighting for parking, paying for parking, watching the price of gas, worrying about whether you've had too much to drink at a dinner out in order to drive home, or if your car will get a ticket because you've been on the street for too long. The freedom to choose what you spend your time on and how you move around. I want to talk a little bit then about the automobile, because since the proliferation of the automobile in the early 20th century, we've been told that cars were our way to freedom and independence, and everybody wanted one, and our cities and communities were totally built around the expectation that you would have 1, 2, 3 cars, maybe more. And that expectation and that wanting and that design of communities to require cars eventually became no longer about having the choice to want a car and buy a car and own a car, but a necessity. So over time, it was no longer about something you were free to choose and something that gave you freedom and independence, but something that you could not function in society without, until it was no longer about that independence, but about total dependence. And that dependence has become a chain around a lot of us. It's hard to think about living in British Columbia in most of British Columbia, without a truck or a car. And in fact, regularly, when I talk about transit or active transportation, like walking and cycling as options that we need to encourage people towards, it is very common that people will respond by saying, but I can't use those modes because I need my car or my truck for a variety of reasons. One line sticks out in my mind is I remember somebody told me, Bowinn, I can't and I'm not going to take my chickens on the bus with me. So let me be clear. When we talk about needing to enable more people to take the bus or transit or ride their bike or walk or live in transit-oriented developments and so forth, we are not talking about forcing everybody to give up their vehicles and get on a bus. That is not what we are talking about. I'm not going to be suggesting that anyone should be designing our SkyTrain cars, for instance, to transport cows to the processor or to be able to move steel beams onto the construction site by public transit. You're probably still going to need your vehicle for that. But governments are about making life better for people. And one of the ways that we can do that is to give people more choice about how they move around and how they live their lives. Give them the freedom to choose to leave their car behind for a night out on the town, or to the freedom to know that their children can safely travel to and from school on their own, the freedom to have the option of not sitting in traffic 3 hours a day, the freedom to not have to worry about whether the price of gas is going to impact your ability to afford the rest of your bills. And on top of that, given that transportation accounts for well over a third of greenhouse gas emissions here in this province right now, providing residents with the choice to live without being dependent on a car is way, way better from a climate perspective as well. And so that's what Bill 16 is about, Mr. Speaker. The Transportation Amendment Act, not an exciting name, but at its core, it is about a new approach to transportation that focuses on why we invest in transportation in the first place, which is the people, enabling better lives, more livable communities in our province well into the future, and making life better for people, families, and communities in British Columbia. Thank you so much.